The gentle giants of the stars. Across the mapped expanse of the known galaxy, humanity had earned a reputation unlike any other rising power in recorded history. They were not feared. They were trusted. Where other species arrived in new systems with fleets of warships and demands of submission, humans arrived with hospital vessels and translators. Their first orbital stations were rarely armed. Their first messages were never ultimatums. They brought water purification systems to desert worlds that had never known rain. They stabilized failing starside habitats abandoned by older civilizations. They mediated disputes that had lasted centuries without ever raising a weapon. And perhaps most unsettling of all, they asked for nothing in return. To ancient empires hardened by endless cycles of conquest, this behavior made no sense. Power was meant to be used. Strength was meant to be asserted. Expansion was meant to benefit the strong, not uplift the weak. Yet humanity seemed uninterested in dominance. Their fleets were impressive, yes, sleek vessels powered by advanced gravitic drives and shield harmonics that rivaled even the oldest galactic powers. But these ships were configured for rescue operations, evacuation logistics, and disaster stabilization, not war. Humanity's military doctrine was openly accessible, another strange decision that baffled strategists across the stars. It emphasized de-escalation, civilian protection, and minimal force engagement. Many assumed this transparency was a deception. It wasn't. Humans simply believed cooperation was more efficient than conquest. Over time, they earned a title spoken with quiet admiration in diplomatic chambers and refugee settlements alike. The gentle giants. It was not because they lacked strength. It was because they chose not to use it. Human diplomats ended conflicts between species who had never before sat in the same room without weapons drawn. Their presence alone often stabilized volatile negotiations. They had even intervened during the collapse of the Valoran trade axis, not to claim territory, but to ensure food shipments continued reaching dependent colonies. Entire civilizations survived because humans decided they should. But while gratitude grew among smaller powers, something else grew among the ambitious. Suspicion. To expansionist regimes like the Dravathi Combine, humanity's restraint appeared less like morality and more like inefficiency. The Combine was a civilization built on conquest. Their society valued strength above all else. To them, peace was not an ideal. It was a temporary condition achieved through dominance. They watched humanity closely. They saw a species with vast territory, immense industrial capacity, and a rapidly growing population. Yet no signs of aggressive expansion, no demands for tribute, no military intimidation. It was, in their eyes, a contradiction. The Combine's high strategists debated the matter for decades. Was humanity hiding its true intentions? Was their kindness merely a calculated long-term strategy? But time passed, and nothing changed. Humans continued to negotiate rather than threaten. They withdrew from contested systems rather than escalate. They even offered aid to species that had previously attacked their colonies. Eventually, the Dravathi reached a conclusion. Humanity was not pretending to be peaceful. They truly were, and that made them vulnerable. To the Combine, this presented an opportunity unlike any other. Here was a rising power that possessed strength but refused to wield it. If pressured correctly, they would yield. If challenged, they would negotiate. If attacked, they would retreat. It was not malice that drove the Combine's decision. It was logic. In their view, a power unwilling to defend its dominance did not deserve it. And so the decision was made. They would test humanity. The target was carefully chosen. New Carthage, a thriving human colony on the edge of explored space. It was prosperous, lightly defended, symbolic. If humanity surrendered it peacefully, the message would be clear to the rest of the galaxy. Strength belongs to those willing to use it. The invasion fleet arrived without warning. Dravathi warships dropped from faster-than-light transit into low orbit, their angular hulls casting long shadows over the colony cities. Planetary defenses activated immediately, but they were minimal designed more for asteroid deflection than warfare. Human authorities transmitted diplomatic requests within minutes. They asked the Combine to state their demands, to negotiate terms, to avoid conflict. The Dravathi responded with silence. Then they began their descent. Dropships pierced the atmosphere. Orbital weapon platforms locked onto infrastructure nodes. Not population centers, but strategic assets. It was a calculated show of force. Human defense vessels launched, but instead of engaging, they formed protective corridors for civilian evacuation ships. Across the planet, emergency protocols activated. Cities emptied. Families boarded transports. Human pilots escorted them into orbit while Dravathi forces secured landing zones below. There was no counterattack, no retaliatory strike. Within hours, the Combine flag was raised above New Carthage's administrative complex. And still, humanity did not respond with violence. They requested dialogue. Across the galaxy, observers watched in disbelief. A colony had been taken, without resistance, without war. Some praised humanity's restraint. Others whispered that perhaps the gentle giants were not giants at all. In the command chambers of the Dravathi High Fleet, confirmation arrived. Human forces had withdrawn from the system entirely. No reinforcements were en route. No retaliation had been launched. The test had succeeded. The conclusion seemed undeniable. Humanity would not fight. And if they would not fight, then nothing stood in the way of taking more. The order was given. Prepare the next advance. And somewhere, far from the eyes of the galaxy, humanity began to reconsider what kindness truly meant. The cost of kindness. The fall of New Carthage did not ignite war. It ignited hope. Human leadership, true to their long-standing principles, responded not with retaliation, but with outreach. Within hours of the colony's occupation, diplomatic envoys transmitted formal requests for dialogue to the Dravathi Combine. They offered mediation through the Galactic Assembly. They proposed shared administration of the system to avoid further escalation. To humanity, conflict was a failure of understanding. An understanding could be repaired. But to the Combine, these messages confirmed what they already believed. Humans would not fight. The next target was chosen even more boldly: the mining system of Helios Reach. It was a vital supplier of raw materials for several human worlds, but like many outer colonies, its defenses were limited. Humanity had never expected war to come from the stars they had helped stabilize. The invasion followed the same pattern. Overwhelming force, strategic seizure of infrastructure, minimal civilian targeting. And once again, humanity withdrew. They evacuated personnel, preserved life, and requested negotiations. The Dravathi High Command began to view the situation not as conquest, but as inevitability. 3 more systems fell in the following weeks. And still, humanity did not retaliate. Instead, they increased their diplomatic efforts. Delegations traveled across neutral space seeking intervention. They asked neighboring powers to help broker peace. They even offered economic concessions in exchange for withdrawal. To many observers in the galaxy, this was admirable. But to others, it was unsettling, because each peaceful appeal was met with silence. Or worse, progress. Dravathi fleets moved deeper into human territory with growing confidence. Their formations became less cautious, their strikes more direct. They began targeting shipyards, not to destroy them entirely, but to ensure humanity could not rebuild defensive capability quickly. They disabled research stations. They seized transport hubs. Human rescue fleets followed in their wake, evacuating workers and scientists before occupation could be completed. Across human space, the pattern was clear. Preserve life. Avoid escalation. Maintain the moral high ground. For a time it worked. Casualties remained low. Worlds were lost, but population survived. The Galactic Assembly convened emergency sessions to discuss intervention. Yet hesitation dominated the chamber. Humanity themselves urged patience. They believed the Combine would eventually negotiate. They had to. No species would sustain expansion without limits. No civilization would ignore the cost of prolonged occupation. Kindness, humanity believed, would eventually be recognized. Then came the Creo's Corridor. A convoy of civilian transports was en route through the narrow trade passage. Hundreds of vessels carrying displaced families from Helios reached toward inner systems. The ships bore universal humanitarian markings. Their routes had been transmitted in advance to all known military forces, including the Combine. They were unarmed, escorted only by a handful of medical frigates. Halfway through the corridor, Dravathi warships emerged from faster-than-light transit. Their formation surrounded the convoy in silence. The lead human transport transmitted identification codes and evacuation status. The Dravathi replied with a single demand: surrender all passengers for resettlement processing. Human command aboard the convoy refused. Negotiations began immediately. They offered inspection. They offered escort. They offered to divert course. The Dravathi did not negotiate. Minutes later, their targeting systems activated. The first shot shattered a medical frigate. Panic spread through the convoy. Transports attempted evasive maneuvers, but they were not built for combat. The Dravathi disabled engines. Then they fired again and again. Within 20 minutes, the Creo's Corridor was filled with drifting debris. Escape pods, fragments of civilian hulls, emergency beacons blinking into the void. Millions died. The surviving ships scattered, broadcasting distress signals across every frequency. Human rescue fleets arrived too late. What they found was not a battlefield. It was a graveyard. The footage spread through human networks within hours. Across colonies and core worlds alike, people watched the final transmissions of the convoy. The pleas, the confusion, the quiet determination of pilots who refused to abandon their passengers, and the silence that followed. For the first time since the invasion began, humanity did not respond with negotiation. They responded with mourning. Memorials appeared overnight. Public channels filled with names of the lost. Entire cities fell into silence. Not anger, not yet. Grief. But beneath that grief, something shifted. For generations, humanity had believed kindness could shape the galaxy. That empathy was strength. That cooperation was survival. Now they were forced to confront a possibility they had never truly accepted. What if kindness was not enough? In secure chambers far from public view, human leadership convened. Military command presented their assessments. The Combine had interpreted restraint as weakness, negotiation as surrender, compassion as vulnerability. And unless something changed, they would continue. Humanity faced a choice they had avoided for centuries: continue offering peace, or ensure they would never again be mistaken for prey. The decision was not made quickly. Debate lasted days. But when it ended, a single directive was issued to the Defense Council: prepare escalation protocols, not for revenge, not for conquest, but for protection. Because the galaxy had just learned what humanity's kindness cost, and humanity had just learned what its absence might require. The day the kindness ended, the shift did not begin with anger. It began with silence. Across human space, the grief that followed the destruction of the Creo's Corridor convoy settled into something colder. Memorials remained lit. Names continued to scroll across public networks. Families mourned. But behind that mourning, decisions were being made. For the first time in generations, humanity stopped asking how to avoid war and began asking how to end one. Escalation protocols were activated. They were not new. They had existed for centuries, carefully maintained, constantly updated, and intentionally used. Humanity had always prepared for the possibility that peace might fail. They had simply never believed they would need to act. Now they did. Shipyards once dedicated to rescue vessels and scientific platforms began silent reconfiguration. Civilian evacuation fleets were reassigned deeper into protected space. Strategic defense networks, long dormant, came online. Yet outwardly, nothing changed. Human diplomats still requested dialogue. Human leadership still transmitted offers of ceasefire. And the Dravathi Combine saw this as confirmation that nothing had shifted. Their fleets advanced further. They fortified their hold on occupied systems and began preparing for the next phase, integration. To the Combine, the conquest was nearly complete. They believed humanity was adjusting to loss. They were wrong. The first counteraction came without warning. In the occupied Helios Reach system, Dravathi Command detected a brief anomaly in local space, a distortion lasting less than a second. Then their orbital shipyard went dark. No explosion, no debris field, no visible attack. Power systems failed simultaneously across the structure. Defensive grids shut down. Communication relays went silent. Within minutes, human vessels emerged from low-visibility transit. They did not fire. They did not bombard. Instead, they deployed precision strike drones that targeted only military systems. Weapon arrays were disabled. Command nodes isolated. Docked warships immobilized without hull breaches. The entire facility was rendered inoperable within hours. Dravathi crews were left alive, confused, and utterly powerless. Then the human fleet withdrew. Across the system, not a single civilian structure had been touched. No population centers were harmed. No retaliation came against the colony's infrastructure. The message was unmistakable. Humanity was no longer retreating. The Combine responded immediately. They launched a counteroffensive, dispatching multiple strike groups toward nearby human systems, expecting the same defensive withdrawals they had encountered before. Instead, they met resistance. Human ships engaged for the first time since the invasion began. Not recklessly, not with overwhelming destruction, but with calculated precision. Combined attack formations found their targeting systems disrupted before they could fire. Their engines failed mid-maneuver. Their shield harmonics collapsed under focused interference. Entire squadrons were neutralized without catastrophic loss of life. Humanity was not seeking destruction. They were seeking control. Within weeks, the pattern repeated across occupied space. Military installations vanished from operational status overnight. Supply chains were severed. Command networks collapsed. Where Dravathi fleets attempted to regroup, human forces intercepted them, not with overwhelming firepower, but with tactics designed to dismantle capability rather than annihilate it. For the first time, the Combine faced an enemy they could not intimidate, nor predict. Human strategy did not mirror traditional warfare. They did not seize territory. They did not pursue fleeing ships. They struck only where the ability to wage war existed, and they struck relentlessly. Weeks turned into months. The Combine's once formidable expansion corridors fractured under constant disruption. Their fleets dwindled, not from mass casualties, but from systemic disablement. Ships that survived engagements were left unable to fight again. Shipyards could not rebuild. Command structures could not coordinate. And still, humanity did not invade. They did not retaliate against Dravathi home systems. They did not target civilian populations. They did not seek vengeance. They sought only one outcome: the end of aggression. Across the galaxy, observers began to understand what they were witnessing. This was not the rage of a wounded species. It was the resolve of one that had decided suffering would no longer be tolerated. Human kindness had once meant absorbing harm to prevent escalation. Now it meant preventing harm by ending the ability to cause it, and that required action. The turning point came when a major combined war fleet attempted a final offensive push toward the human core. They expected hesitation. They expected negotiation. Instead, they encountered a human defensive formation that did not yield. The battle that followed was swift. Precision strikes dismantled command ships. Electronic warfare blinded targeting arrays. Propulsion systems failed across the fleet. Within hours, the offensive had ended before it truly began. Survivors drifted in disabled vessels, alive but defeated. Human rescue teams arrived shortly after, not to imprison, not to execute, but to stabilize, to recover, to ensure survival. It was then the galaxy understood the truth. Humanity had not abandoned kindness. They had redefined it, because kindness without boundaries invites destruction. And when humanity stopped being kind in the way the galaxy had known, they became something far more formidable. Not conquerors, not destroyers, but protectors who would no longer hesitate. The day the kindness ended, the balance of power began to shift. The new balance of power. By the time the Dravathi Combine realized they were losing, the war was already over. Not in the traditional sense. No homeworld had been invaded, no cities burned, no governments toppled. Their people still lived beneath the same skies. Their leaders still occupied their seats of power. But their fleets no longer functioned. Their shipyards could not produce. Their command networks had collapsed into fragmented silence. The machinery of conquest, the very foundation of their dominance, had been methodically dismantled, and humanity had never once crossed into their core systems. Across the galaxy, military analysts struggled to define what had happened. This was not annihilation. It was disarmament. Human strategy had followed a single, unwavering principle: in the ability to harm, without becoming the harm. One by one, occupied human systems were restored, not through invasion, but through withdrawal. Dravathi forces found themselves unable to maintain control. With supply lines severed and fleets immobilized, their presence became unsustainable. Human ships returned only after occupation ended, not as conquerors, but as stabilizers. They rebuilt infrastructure. They restored trade routes. They assisted displaced populations. Even those who had served under the Combine were not punished. There were no tribunals, no purges, no vengeance campaigns. To the astonishment of the galaxy, humanity treated the aftermath of war as they would any other disaster, with compassion, but this time with clarity. When the final Dravathi war fleet stood down, not destroyed, but unable to continue, their leadership transmitted a request, not for surrender, but for dialogue. For the first time since the invasion began, the Combine sought negotiation. Humanity accepted. The meeting took place in neutral space. No warships, no threats, just representatives from both civilizations. The Dravathi expected demands: reparations, territorial concessions, perhaps even occupation. Instead, humanity presented a single proposal: demilitarization of expansion fleets, monitoring of strategic production, mutual non-aggression, no tribute, no submission, only the assurance that what had happened could not happen again. To the Combine, this was incomprehensible. They had initiated war. They had caused devastation. They had taken worlds. And yet, humanity sought not dominance, but stability. The agreement was signed, not because the Combine had been forced to kneel, but because they had nothing left with which to fight. When news spread across the galaxy, reactions were immediate. Expansionist empires recalculated their ambitions. Neutral powers sought human alliances. Even ancient hegemonies began revising doctrines that had remained unchanged for millennia. Because now, the truth was undeniable. Human kindness had never been weakness. It had been a choice. And the moment humanity chose differently, the balance of power shifted. Trade routes stabilized under renewed cooperation. Conflict zones saw reduced escalation as smaller powers realized humanity would no longer passively endure aggression. Piracy declined. Border wars cooled. The knowledge spread quietly but firmly. Humanity would still help. Humanity would still negotiate. Humanity would still forgive. But humanity would no longer suffer in silence. Generations later, historians would mark this era not as the human war, but as the human turning, the moment when compassion gained boundaries, when peace gained enforcement, when kindness gained strength. Because humanity had not become cruel. They had not abandoned empathy. They had simply learned that protecting the vulnerable sometimes required decisive action. And in doing so, they reshaped the expectations of an entire galaxy. No longer would kindness be mistaken for surrender. No longer would restraint be mistaken for incapability. No longer would peace depend on the goodwill of aggressors alone. From that day forward, cooperation with humanity carried new meaning. Their outstretched hand still offered partnership, But now, behind it stood the quiet certainty of resolve. And so the galaxy changed, not because humanity became conquerors, but because they proved they did not need to be. They remained builders, diplomats, protectors, but they were no longer gentle giants who absorbed harm in hope of understanding. They were guardians who ensured understanding could not be enforced through violence. The lesson endured for centuries. Kindness is powerful, but only when it is chosen. And the day humanity stopped being kind without limits was the day the galaxy finally learned to respect peace.